Cutting a swath of destruction across the borders of Middle East nations, the savagery and bloodlust of ISIS is shocking. But where did they get their funding? And just how were they able to commandeer so much wealth and Western military hardware? Some in Washington say it's because ISIS took advantage of Barack Obama's lack of resolve to stay the course with U.S. military intervention in the Middle East. But a closer look reveals that dereliction by both the Democrats and Republicans in Washington contributed to the rise of the ISIS crisis. Retired Air Force Lieutenant General Thomas McInerney conceded that the United States government helped to empower the ISIS hordes.
But what are the potential downsides, the consequences of arming some of the moderate rebels in Syria? When we see reports like what happened just last week, that the Free Syrian Army was apparently participating in the abduction of 40-some UN peacekeepers in the Golan Heights. Are these the people that we want to start supplying with weapons?
Well, Syria, we backed, I believe, in some cases, some of the wrong people, and not in the right part of the Free Syrian Army. And that's a little confusing to people. So I've always maintained, to go back quite some time, that we were backing the wrong types. I think it's going to turn out maybe this weekend in a new special that Brett Baer is going to have Friday that's going to show some of those weapons from Benghazi ended up in the hands of ISIS. So we helped build ISIS. Now there's a danger there, and I'm with you.
At a Senate hearing on ISIS, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham became defensive upon receiving testimony from the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, that funding of the Syrian rebels was a significant factor in the rise of ISIS.
So our national defense, in terms of stopping ISIL from killing thousands or millions of Americans if they get the capability, really comes down to whether or not we can convince the Arab world to go in there and defeat these guys.
It really comes down to building a coalition so that what the Arab Muslim world sees is them rejecting ISIS, not
They
us
already
defeating
reject
them.
ISIL. Do you know any major Arab ally that embraces ISIL?
I know major Arab allies who fund them.
Yeah, but did they embrace that? They fund them because the Free Syrian Army couldn't fight Assad. They were trying to beat Assad. I think they realized the folly of their ways. Let's don't taint the Mideast unfairly.
Senator Graham objected to singling out supporters of the Syrian rebels as contributing to the rise of ISIS because he and his Republican cohort, Senator John McCain, have long been cheerleaders for Obama's intervention in Syria in support of the rebels. This has come even after these senators supported the Libyan rebels who had been well known to be tied to al-Qaeda. That was the conclusion of the Citizens Commission on Benghazi, an independent panel of distinguished former high-ranking military, CIA, and other intelligence officials. Former CIA officer Claire Lopez summed up the commission's findings.
What I'm saying is that U.S. policy in Libya clearly permitted and facilitated the provision of weapons to known al-Qaeda individuals and groups. I leave it to you, to the media, to the press, to the investigative journalists to find out why we did that and exactly how we did that, but we know that it happened. We know that those weapons flowed. We know that they were permitted into Libya by our people, by NATO and our allies, and we know that those weapons found their way to al-Qaeda jihadis.
Your biggest accusation here is that the United States government facilitated arms going to al-Qaeda. Who did that? Forget about the background. Who did that?
All of the above. The intelligence community was part of that, the Department of State was part of that, and certainly that means that the top leadership of the United States, our national security leadership, and potentially Congress, if they were briefed on this, also knew about this, the Super 8, as we said. Remember, again, what we said. These weapons came into Benghazi, were permitted to enter by our armed forces who were blockading the approaches, both air and sea. They were permitted to come in. That means NATO, that means the United States military, that means the Pentagon knew that these weapons were coming in and that was allowed. We know that our people were on the ground, both State Department and CIA, receiving those weapons off the ships.
And there was no
distributing them to the people that I've just named to you, whom they knew perfectly well, who they were.
Kentucky Senator Rand Paul has been adamant that U.S. intervention into Iraq, Libya, and Syria was a key factor in the development of ISIS.
Well, do you know where the safe haven is? The safe haven's in Syria. So those who, but let me finish. Because the thing is that they would not be empowered in Iraq if we were not providing safe haven in Syria by arming their allies.
So should we go to Syria? I mean, the thing is, we kind of are where we are.
No,
so
well, we are where we are because we are where we are because we armed the Syrian rebels. We have been fighting alongside Al-Qaeda, fighting alongside ISIS. ISIS is now emboldened in 2 countries. But here's the anomaly. We're with ISIS in Syria. We're on the same side of the war. So those who want to get involved to stop ISIS in Iraq are allied with ISIS in Syria. That is the real contradiction to this whole policy.
Right. And many of your Republican colleagues would argue that what we should have done in Syria was get rid of Assad, and that would have stopped ISIS in his tracks. But
we've done this. Look at Libya. We went into Libya and we got rid of that terrible Gaddafi. Now it's a jihadist wonderland over there. There's jihadists everywhere. If we were to get rid of Assad, it would be a jihadist wonderland in Syria. It's now a jihadist wonderland in Iraq, precisely because we got over-involved, not because we had too little involvement, but too much involvement.
And here we are.
Well, we should have not armed them. If we wouldn't have armed them in Syria, maybe they wouldn't be in Iraq.
Right?
So well, the past is 6 months ago. The past is still the current as well. It is the present. We are still arming the radical Islamic rebels in Syria.
But I think what some of these questions are getting at, in order to understand what's happening here, is why? Why on earth would this policy be set in motion?
And what you're describing today is it's treason. I mean, it's not even un-American, it's insane. I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, utterly insane.
Yes, it may be insane, but there's a method to the madness of all those involved, including the Obama administration, the Hillary Clinton State Department, and members of Congress from both major parties, as defined by John McCain's wild-eyed push to arm the Syrian rebels. And it is the main reason why they all have resisted attempts to have the Benghazi attack fully investigated. These events are part of a mad, Machiavellian attempt to realize a utopian dream by an incremental process to erode the sovereignty of all nations into regional geopolitical blocs like the European Union. It's not a new dream. Elitist globalists have been pragmatically working on the project for generations. Lincoln P. Bloomfield Sr. was a longtime globalist political science professor at MIT, a State Department official for 11 years, and author. His son, Lincoln P. Bloomfield Jr., was an Assistant Secretary of State in the George W. Bush administration. In 1962, at a time when the concept of a European Union was not even imagined by the general population, Bloomfield Sr. was tasked under contract with the State Department to prepare a feasibility study containing a scenario in which a global government could occur. His report, entitled A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations, outlined the steps necessary, including specific intermediary stages in which ever larger units evolve, eroding nation-states into a gradual process of regionalism. Bloomfield assessed that such a gradual process could take several hundred years to develop the consensus necessary among populations, unless the process were short-circuited by sudden jolts to accelerate its development. He wrote, "I have suggested that an alternative road may bypass the main path of history, short-circuiting the organic stages of consensus, value formation, and the experiences of common enterprise generally believed to underlie political community. This relies on a grave crisis or war to bring about a sudden transformation in national attitudes sufficient for the purpose. According to this version, the order we examine may be brought into existence as a result of a series of sudden, nasty, and traumatic shocks." And now, exactly according to the Bloomfield model, the ISIS crisis is not being wasted by today's Machiavellian globalists who are prodding Arab nations into finally accepting a Middle East version of the European Union. The Council on Foreign Relations, the prominent globalist think tank, posted this article on its website in June of 2014. Entitled "The EU Offers a Model for Unifying the Middle East," it reads, "Not long ago, Europe was a continent that resembled how the Middle East looks today. After all, most of its problems, terrorism, poverty, unemployment, sectarianism, refugee crises, water shortages, require regional answers. No country can solve its problems on its own. That mantra will be heard increasingly around the globe as more created crises will be cited to coerce other nations into their own regional integration. The author of the piece, Ed Hussein, is the same man who wrote on that same CFR website in 2012 that the Free Syrian Rebel Army, quote, needs al-Qaeda now. It is this Machiavellian mindset that allowed U.S. military supplies into the hands of al-Qaeda factions in Syria, as many of those factions have now morphed into ISIS in both Syria and Iraq. Ever wonder why these two, who seem to be so recklessly eager to arm those Syrian rebels and force nation-building upon Middle East nations, are part of the same Gang of Eight who refuse to secure the borders of our own nation here in the U.S.? That's because their real objective in both locations is the same. Not nation-building, but region-building, the systematic erosion of national sovereignty into regional jurisdictions, the regional answers being pushed by the Council on Foreign Relations. Those involved include not only this bunch, but a whole cast of characters in the Washington and global establishment from both major political parties who have bought into the CFR agenda.
It's good to have an outpost of the Council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the Council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing. And
it's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
For decades, the icon of the CFR mindset has been Henry Kissinger, the grand poobah of globalism. At a 2009 confab in Berlin, appearing with former Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Schmidt, Kissinger commented on the future of Islam.
The problem of the future of Islam will be one of the huge global problems of the next decades. As Islam organizes itself either into larger states or one unit, but as Islam organizes itself.
Did you hear that, America? Kissinger is predicating his entire comment upon his certainty that Islam will organize itself into larger states or one unit, the exact terminology that Lincoln P. Bloomfield used over 50 years ago to describe the emergence of ever larger units, the regional blocs we see forming today. America, did you know that this region building was the real objective in the Middle East? American blood and treasure is being spent right now in building and securing the CFR's mad, utopian vision of a Middle East union. Now, back to Kissinger's comment.
As Islam organizes itself either into larger states or one unit, but as Islam organizes itself, if it becomes an issue of conversion by Islam of the rest of the world, then other regions will be drawn into confrontation. If Islam operates on a basis, however it is internally, but where towards the outside world, it recognizes a multilateral and pluralistic approach, then it would be an important component of the international system.
Kissinger likely would prefer the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as the example for a greater Islamic one-unit government. However, it is run internally. After all, the Saudi kingdom purportedly mutilates and beheads only those within its jurisdiction as it deals with Kissinger's outside world in a businesslike manner. Saudi Arabia is also the dominant anchor nation of an emerging core bloc of nations on the Arabian Peninsula known as the Gulf Cooperation Council. That bloc of Arab monarchies has already been developing the multilateral mentality desired by the globalists. As the GCC takes steps to finalize the integration of its member nations' economies and militaries, it is now being pushed to lead the rest of the Middle East in an expanded pan-Arab coalition against ISIS, and eventually to a greater Middle East union.
An unprecedented regional response 5 Arab countries taking part in the US-led airstrikes on ISIS in Syria.
And such an Arab regional military coalition's war against ISIS is a key step in developing the Arab nations into, quote, experiences of common enterprise to underlie political community, as Lincoln Bloomfield's model prescribes.
As the sun sets on this, the first day of airstrikes, what we are seeing is the emergence of a pan-Arab Gulf coalition. Countries here pushing aside deep regional divisions to tackle head-on the immediate threat of ISIS, and in doing so, healing recent rifts and reshaping, possibly, their political future.
For the globalists, ISIS serves their purposes in 3 ways. Its savage sweep across national borders is spooking more compliant Middle East nations into pooling their sovereignty in defense, while the ISIS swath of destruction also aids in toppling regimes that resist compliance into the globalist regional bloc network, such as Assad's Syria and Iraq. And the brutal ISIS executions, particularly of citizens from Western nations, is another sudden, nasty, and traumatic shock that the Bloomfield model requires to bring about a sudden change in national attitudes. This enables even more foreign aid and military assistance to the Middle East region, even as the public remains largely unaware that this Machiavellian region-building project is the globalists' ulterior motive. The Obama administration's recent suggestion of jobs programs for radical Islamic areas has received a deserved amount of criticism and derision. But a plan to promote jobs in the Middle East has for years also been part of the rhetoric from Republicans, such as former vice presidential candidate and Congressman Paul Ryan, as part of a plan from the Bush administration to establish a MIFTA, a Middle East Free Trade Agreement. Speaking at Where Else?, the Council on Foreign Relations in 2009, Ryan spoke of creating jobs in the Middle East.
One of the things that I worked on in one of my portfolios in the Ways and Means Committee is to shepherd through the trade agreements with Middle Eastern nations. That's the way we work in Ways and Means. We divide up regions of the world to be specialists to shepherd these things through. We're off to a good start with what we call the MIFTA, the Middle East Free Trade Area Initiative. Launched by the last administration, it got off to a very good start. And the idea of the MIFTA was basically 20 moderate Muslim countries in the Middle East, in the Arab Peninsula, in the Maghreb region, and you get these 20 countries on the path toward free trade agreements, starting with TIFAs, getting them involved in the WTO, and going into ultimately having free trade agreements. Now, why is this helpful and why is this good and important? Number one, just from a purely economic standpoint, it's good for U.S. exports. It's good for promoting jobs. Number two, it's good for promoting jobs and economic activity and development in these countries.
Bush administration initiatives pushing a MIFTA were only the first steps in forming a Middle East Union, as evidenced in the European Union and other regions around the globe. In April of 2012, a delegation of U.S. senators and congressmen actually traveled to Tanzania in East Africa to push the East African Community of Nations, a sub-regional bloc of the African Union, to complete plans for an actual federation of those nations. When later questioned about his participation, Florida Congressman Jeff Miller acknowledged that he was, quote, in the room for this meeting. Why would it be the objective of U.S. senators and congressmen to encourage such a federation of nations? Because it is the natural progression and result of this so-called free trade crowd's goal to realize the very definition of their free trade, which is the free flow of goods, services, and people across national borders within these trade blocs. Free traders in Congress cannot reconcile their tough talk on defending U.S. borders with their objective of the free movement of people across these borders. Of course, this free movement of people across regional borders wouldn't really be free, but would necessitate close monitoring by a vast regional jurisdiction. And that is why the EAC nations are simultaneously adopting national identity cards that are standardized throughout the EAC nations, thus producing de facto regional ID cards. Remember this when considering how U.S. politicians from both major parties promoted the Real ID Act and other proposals for a national ID in America. It only serves their purposes for a North American ID. This video is an update of the 2013 video on YouTube, Blockheads, Builders of the New World Order, and offers new and additional evidence that confirms the reports and observations contained in blockheads. That video was a comprehensive analysis that thoroughly defined and documented region-building efforts within all of the world's emerging major regional blocs and how those efforts corroborated the hard evidence of region building in North America. This map that has been featured throughout this video is from a video produced by a business advisory council in the Philippines. It displays the world's developing regional blocs, including the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Economic Community, or AEC, and its model, the European Union. The ASEAN Economic Community is slated for launch in late 2015. Recall that the European Union was first organized as the European Economic Community in the 1950s and 60s. Thus we see the pattern as ASEAN and the world's other developing regional blocs march through the stages of regional integration toward geopolitical union, following the example of the EU. Here is a clip from that ASEAN video.
Can you imagine this? In one part of the world, 10 countries come together to define themselves as one. Within Asia, in a 10-country grouping called ASEAN, a unified force with a population of more than 600 million people that would rank as the 8th largest economy in the world, with an estimated value of $2.356 trillion, potentially larger than the GDP of India, Russia, or Brazil. 600 million people moving as one economy. We are expanding the borders of home, redefining what we mean by community. Moving as one, we can compete in key sectors with other regional blocs and bigger economies. The ASEAN economic integration mandates cooperation, not competition. It is about collaborations that foster regional pride. Ultimately, it is not just about countries, but the combined market strength of an entire region rising as one. Get ready for the ASEAN Economic Community.
With this regional map, the AEC promotional video alludes to the created competition underlying this evil genius plan to build and strengthen all of the world's major regions simultaneously. This competition will not be limited to economic, but will also encompass security issues. Again, echoing Bloomfield's 1962 model that relied upon a grave crisis or war to accelerate the development of larger units, Henry Kissinger, in his 2009 New York Times op-ed, The Chance for a New World Order, described the currently developing regional competition as a new mercantilism of competing regional units. Historical mercantilism of the 16th to 18th centuries was characterized by political and economic consolidation of resources from the far reaches of each competing empire. Kissinger's new mercantilism would result in a regional jurisdiction over the harnessing of resources from member nations within each bloc to counter the perceived or conceived threats from other blocs. This sinister plan for regional consolidation of political and economic resources in a crisis or war environment would serve to stifle dissent among each region's member nations, paving the way for each region's further consolidation and eventual federation into a global network. Kissinger offered the regional mercantilism scenario as an ominous long-term alternative process in the event that nations today refuse to acquiesce to some sort of immediate international political regulatory system, a de facto world government. Since grassroots resistance among many national populations has rendered such a near-term global system unlikely, Kissinger's order out of chaos regional mercantilism likely will intensify. In Kissinger's new mercantilism, regional blocs, including an eventual amalgamated North America, will jostle for advantage and to limit the political and economic influence of rival regions. At his 2009 Berlin conference with Helmut Schmidt, Kissinger, in his carrot and stick approach, spoke ominously about how all of the emerging units would strengthen through competition and perceived outside threats.
What would be catastrophic in the long run is if you had an Asian unit led by China, a European unit, and then some American counter unit, that would lead to 19th century type diplomacy conducted by regional blocs that have huge weapons and enormous resources.
What is being lost in media accounts of the Ukraine crisis is that it's not just a European Union conflict with Russia over Ukraine, but with Vladimir Putin's Eurasian Union, which he has publicly stated is modeled after the EU, NAFTA, and other blocs based on WTO principles. Putin's Eurasian Union is being targeted under the 1992 Wolfowitz Doctrine, named for neocon globalist, former World Bank president, and U.S. Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz. His aim was, quote, to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. Significantly, the Eurasian Union is positioned to gain influence as far south as Iran, as this LeavenworthArmy.mil website and other sources indicate. The Ukraine crisis signals the beginning of Henry Kissinger's new mercantilism, referred to today as the New Cold War. Accordingly, media reports within both sides of today's Ukraine crisis acknowledge the other region as being useful in the deeper integration of their own regional bloc. Meanwhile, the ISIS crisis has become the latest in this series of created crises in this global organized crime scheme. In their bloodlust to rid the Arab region and the world of those they consider infidels, most of the ISIS hordes are unaware that they have become the latest hitman for globalist thugs. ISIS is the hatchet man that these thugs have empowered and then point to in their global shakedown of populations to accept their grand protection scheme of regional answers. The current war on terror is only pursuing the hitman. Unless it indicts the bosses of this international racketeering and bankster extortion of populations, their chaos and tyranny will only get worse.